Today I want to speak about the relationship between religious institutions and local communities during the post-Carolingian period. Um, I think it's very interesting because during the collapse of the Carolingian Empire, a great deal of local authority and social relations weren't just organized under the seigneurial rule, but also by the church. And it's very interesting because it's a moment in which the public authority collapses, as it's widely known, and in which there is a lot of experimentation, both from the layman's side, and from the clergyman. And it's very fascinating, according to me, because today, without stressing too much analogies, but we are assisting a bit to this. I mean, statal entities are still there, obviously, and are obviously not like in the post-Carolingian period, but we are assisting to a world that is basically changing its shape beyond statal organization and understanding what happened in some moments of history, like the post-Carolingian times in this case, I think can give some useful information and knowledge about um, how communities really can develop autonomously, independently from um, the um, the public authority, but also with the help of, let's say, public I don't know how to say that, um, entities, like such in this case the church. Naturally, we're talking about a moment in history in which religion was really pervasive in every aspect of um, of people's lives, and because these people actually really believed. Telling the truth, during the Carolingian Empire, as we have seen in other videos, a great part of the populations that um, had been subdued by the Carolingian Empire was just superficially influenced by religion. Even the same Frankish heartland was arguably not, I can't say not fully Christianized, but it certainly retained much of old paganism and cults related to it. So I think it's all the more meaningful to see how the um, the religious powers, in a certain sense, had to relate with these populations in the absence of a public authority, also in strictly religious and cultural terms, to offer a guide, uh, uh, not just a strictly spiritual guide, but also, sort of, and we will be seeing this afterwards anyway, so I'm not gonna spoil that. Um, and however, first of all, we have to understand that the framework of post-Carolingian um, political and social organization was still, both in work and in everyday life, in the very thick and changing economical political net of the seigneurial, of the rural lords, let's say, and other local, essentially laymen's power. This is, when we are talking about post-Carolingian Europe, let's say, um, we obviously have always to remember that even though public authority collapsed, It's not that there wasn't anything. This vacuum was immediately filled by um, by smaller local powers, namely, mostly actually the so-called comites in Latin, that is the counts. There were these the smaller territorial lords that were recognized um, by the public authority, um, and that in a certain sense didn't even come after the disgregation. They were part of the reason why the Carolingian Empire disgregated itself. So it wasn't a society devoid of a guide, of a political point of reference. The lords, doesn't matter how small or how territorially weak, in terms of political and military control, where they were still point of reference for many communities, and this would obviously develop much of their mm, prerogatives during the High Middle Ages, and that would be maintained eventually afterwards. But what we're talking about now is the guide, the presence, and the comfort, in some measure, of given to society by a not less thick net of religious entities. The church does play, and had been playing actually, because um, it's not that this hadn't been present during the Carolingian Empire, and not even before. During the progressive fall and disgregation of the Merovingian Empire, especially there wasn't feudalism, yet. Excuse me. So in Merovingian times, when the Frankish monarchy, shrunk to these essentially four sub-kingdoms fighting each other, and peripheral areas were left on their own. The greatest local powers were actually represented by the bishops, that had, especially in those areas where urbanization was stronger. So we're talking about mostly about central and southern Gaul, and just for speaking about the Merovingian, within the Merovingian borders, or at least the formal ones that existed since the time of Clovis, it was the church who essentially ruled the local populations. With feudalism, things change, because while in Merovingian times there was essentially we can define it as a late antique period of formal organization with a theoretical centralized power. During Carolingian times, power was shifted in on the local base to these counts that had received feud. So here, all these lords that ruled in the name of the king, and that therefore started to represent even sort of competitory entity to the old um, um, clergy system, territorially speaking. And obviously lords were, the ones that carried the sword. Also bishops did carry the sword, but we will focus about that later. But what I mean is that lay power was, in this sense, stronger than it had been in Merovingian times, both during the Carolingian period and after it. And even though we should remember also that the church had been given by the same public Carolingian power many administrative tasks. So even the role of certain religious entities had grown during Carolingian times, and after the collapse of public authority had gained a more, I would say, a more capillary, I don't know how to say that in English, um, and local route, I'd say. Because as I said previously, most of pre-Carolingian church territorial organization was basically derived basically from the bishopric and the various parishes. So there was always this idea that the center of the bishop's power in Gaul was the city, and the countryside was left relatively untouched by this. Um, we have to think about France, especially northern France or western Germany, being places where the world of the forest really played an autonomous rule. There were communities that lived in woods that were substantially untouched even by a late antique culture, even by Roman culture itself in a certain measure. Think about Brittany or I mean other areas that in the countryside that really had remained the way they were since the times of the Iron Age. Um, so what I'm trying to say is that in this post-Carolingian world, the lords had the upper hand, but the church really had a very strong power because the Carolingians had gifted monasteries and the territorial management from the church side had been emphasized during Carolingian times for practical reasons. And this organization obviously was based on the usual system of parishes. First of all, the parishes were basically churches with, I think we can say a fairly long reach. They had a fairly long array of influence, territorially speaking, and they had the task of baptizing. To make the population, attending the liturgical functions during the holidays, and obviously to make penitence, so to communicate, and obviously to be buried, to be given a Christian burial. And the parishes in this sense were the entity that was most strictly related to the local communities, the ones that had to deal with with everyday problems of the believers. Next to them and up to them, there were those other presbyterial churches that increased, especially with the increase of the population and of settlements, and that were therefore eventually founded and that acquired, in some cases, also some parish right. But I think one of the most important religious institutions that were out there and had a very big role in the shaping of post-Carolingian Europe were obviously the monastic communities. monasteries that theoretically were, and genetically we can say had to basically mind about forming um, um, these ascetics, mm, that and basically nothing else. They were theoretically closed within themselves, but that weren't at all such a thing. Monasteries weren't, not even by foundation, conceived as something completely detached from the rest of the Christian world. It wasn't really felt as such. The role of the monks was to show the rest of the world the truest Christian way of life, and therefore um, um, imitating in their community the perfection of the heavens, and pushing the rest of the Christians to live in such a way. So there weren't people who were isolated from the rest of the world. And especially in post-Carolingian Europe, we see that monasteries had an incredibly important role as cultural centers that spread their influence all around. And we're not talking just about an elitary culture of monks, of I don't know, alphabetized, people who had literacy and uh, and that were, by the way, strongly related the, to the lay aristocracy, to tell you the truth, because at least these monastic foundations were really created by most of the times, and especially in this period by the same lords, the same rural lords that maybe sent their cadet sons um, or girls sometimes, um, and that thought that a tie with their family would make these monasteries a very good investment um, for themselves, meaning that by giving land to a monastery that where your son or your nephew is an abbot, um, is really is really a good investment, because monastery theoretically can't be raided, at least by Christians, and it had some prerogatives, so it was quite safe to put wealth in there. But what I think is really important and very fascinating of of the role of monasteries in this time, and especially in local perspective, is the development of hagiographical legends. So of beliefs and cults towards the saints that were destined to spread very largely within the local population. This is a very important part of European cultural life at that time, that really survived through the centuries, and we still can see today. It's basically the idea um, to form a tie between local monasteries and local populations in a very intimate way. Many monasteries were founded originally, and this really began very early in time, but during Carolingian times and post-Carolingian times, this thing was really emphasized because monasteries were sometimes, or most of the times, founded on places where um, the founder saint had usually made a miracle. Mm. There is a lot of beautiful literature about this, and hagiographic and hagiography is really about it. It's really it. Um, the idea that a saint would come to a place that is not a place like anyone else. It's a special place where he's being guided by God or by some of his messengers, sometimes animals, very interestingly, which is also usually related to food and alimentary practices of the local populations. This has been studied in anthropological terms, and and a miracle happens. Like usually, a spring comes out of nothing while the saint was dying of thirst, or I don't know, a field gave immediately um, a lot of fruits and other goods, and helped to build up the monastery, which was really a reflection of how these literally translation, we can say, of um, um, of the difficulties that the monks really had while building these monasteries initially in places where there was nothing else, and that therefore they had to rely strongly on the goods of the earth and of the of what nature, hence God, gave them. A world in which material culture was indeed very important, where even the smaller, I don't know, working tool could mean the difference between life and death, um, and that really had a great role in shaping the not just the monastic communities, but also the local populations that maybe supported this initiative. Um, so, in a certain sense, these monasteries fueled throughout the whole Middle Ages the geography and legends related to that settlement. A settlement that usually was founded over an ancient pagan cult, of which in geography we find very rare, well, not extremely rare, telling the truth, references, meaning that, I don't know, there was a monster like a snake or a dragon, stuff like that, that represented the ancient, maybe the ancient god that according to the locals lived there, and the saints arrive and kills it. Um, and therefore this represents the together with the victory over the surrounding hostile environment, the the full evangelization of the local communities. And it's full of stories like these that were strongly believed and strongly felt by the local populations, and that became part of their identity in a certain way. Because these people truly believed that that legend was true, that the saint did make miracles, and obviously the saint was buried in the monastery, and therefore these monasteries um, had a very great role in comforting and helping and being in constant dialogue with the local population. So we don't find just the monastery as the part of a broader net, often comprising the same maybe local lords with whom the local abbots were um, basically part of as a family. Um, but it's very interesting how in those times there was a very strong bond between monasteries and the rural populations. Um, and we mm, we have to think though that sometimes monasteries were even in opposition with these local lords, because yes, surely we have seen that maybe there were family ties between the monks um, and the local lords, but sometimes there weren't. But especially it wasn't such a very simple dualistic thing. If you look in Carolingian campaigns, well, sorry, I mean in post-Carolingian countryside, um, the the actual you know territorial structures were usually much more complicated than this. You can't really say, oh, this place has a lord and then it has a monastery point. No, it really didn't work like that. There were many lords, several monasteries, and they all had their own competences. They were already in competitions quite fiercely one against the other. It was difficult, especially to understand which the in juridical terms where the authority of a lord began and another and the one of another one stopped. Usually there were solutions and compromises that really benefited the both of them, or the more of them, um, when territorially speaking, meaning that maybe a lord had a certain prerogative over, I don't know, that bridge, so that he could exact a toll every time someone passed on it, and maybe the other lord had the property of that field next to that river, and it was very composite, but it was a very conflictual system most of the times, and even monasteries weren't um, that passive, we can say. This is a period where we still have mostly Benedictine monasteries, but in post-Carolingian times it's where the greatest greatest orders were born. They still believed themselves to be all Benedictines at their um, at that time, but I don't know. In the 10th century, you have the Cluny order that was founded, for instance, and we know how powerful they eventually came to be. So even in that case, the monastery could have maybe an allied lord, or even some gangs of of thugs that could support and comfort their at this point their political action. And also something that is often forgotten is that there were peasant communities that were quite active and quite powerful at their own time. We have this stereotypical belief that the peasants stayed all the time plugged in land, submitted to the Lord. No, no. In post-Carolingian times, I can assure you that peasants were very, very disobedient in a certain sense, very unruly and quarrelsome. Even though, yes, of course, there is the progressive, um, you know, um, 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 process of submission, to local lords, which by the way happened exactly because of this very tumultuous landscape um, of post-Carolingian Europe, where there were many local powers and very few public authority that could intervene um, against injustices, um, and oppression and abuse of power and tyranny, if you want. Um, so I think it's very interesting to look at this framework because um, it's really what happened in our same countrysides. You know, wherever you are from Europe. Here we're talking about Western Europe in terms of Carolingian Empire, but this was the story of all European countryside in a way, um, and um, and they were extremely complex dynamics. We sum them up in this way to, for the sake of didactics, but telling the truth, um, it's very it's very complex to go look at those powers and what they were doing. We don't have an excessive quantity of documents, historically speaking, to research on, but this doesn't mean that the incapability of us to look clearly into it doesn't show really. Um, it's not really accompanied by the evidence through other channels. So this was a very dynamic landscape where I think the most important thing is how these communities really reasoned to find solutions. The Middle Ages is probably the most pragmatic moment in history exactly because of this, because there is no authority, there is no central authority, at least in this time, or at least it's very weak. Um, and therefore, what do we have to do? We have to roll our sleeves and try to find a solution, whether it's fighting, whether it's finding, whether it's negotiating, which was obviously the most frequent, fortunately. Even if though it was a very violent time, definitely negotiations and were at least what they tried first before getting to the sword. Um, but I think it's very fascinating to see how these local powers, in such a completely constantly changing and extremely complex political situation, they could find solutions on their own. Peasants, for instance. There were peasants who negotiated with lords or with monasteries. We have nothing left, or very few left about it, because obviously the peasants couldn't write, and they could put a cross maybe on a document. And obviously those prerogatives that were won by peasants weren't, for instance, saved, because they didn't write, they didn't have a place where to keep them. So that maybe we have those documents where that really showed the victory of a monastery, for instance, because the monks really would write that down and would store it quite jealously um, in the heart of their monasteries to say to the public authority that every once in a while came, look, these guys basically told us that we can use their rights in those places, so we are legally untouchable in a certain sense. But there is a whole world behind that we, in fact, I repeat, we often don't see, we often don't understand, because we really don't know what happened. Also, archaeology is very interesting in this regard in these times, because especially in the country where you know archaeologists tend to dig the least, because obviously the countryside is more extended. There are usually less structures than around city centers, but the world of the country is a very dynamic world, a very surprising world, I'd say. And post-Carolingian Europe is very fascinating. Let's be honest about it. It's especially I like very much French and and German um, and Italian worlds, where yeah, they basically all make up the Carolingian lands. But what I mean is that there was even a common pattern in this Central European area, um, that that eventually shaped, even if in different ways, because obviously, that I now I named France, Germany, and Italy, that really had a lot of differences on their own, and they developed uh, different societies. But there was a common pattern. It was a lot of the Carolingian and post-Carolingian times that really shaped them in similar ways. Mm. And I think it's quite interesting to investigate that, and especially to find the differences, especially related to the territory, because what happens in Picardy cannot be the same as what happens in Bavaria, for instance, or what happens in the Netherlands is not what happens in Lombardy. Uh, but but there are very distinctive features of this organization, mostly, of course, related to the feudal system that is in the that was really set in these areas from those times, and other common features involving, in fact, religious entities and monasteries and so on. And well, I've been rambling enough for today. I hope you enjoyed. If you liked this video, please share it. I will be quite happy about it. And I wish you a nice day or night wherever you are. Thank you very much.